I want to talk about the possible emergence of a new international order. And I want to do this by starting with neutrality. So neutrality, once upon a time, used to be an essential, fundamental part of any conception of international order. What neutrality meant was that you could restrict conflict because there were many countries that were neutral. So conflict was restricted geographically, but it was also restricted in other terms because neutral countries could negotiate, could be diplomats, and allow for the resolution of the conflict between those who were actually fighting. So this version of neutrality survives until, the First World War. At the end of the First World War, what you have happening is the institution through the League of Nations of a system of sanctions. Now, sanctions are a part of total war, as a new book by Nicholas Mulder called The Economic Weapon, which is on sanctions, on the history of sanctions, argues, because what they do is they refuse to differentiate between war and peace. You can have sanctions even without declaring a war, though the effect of sanctions can be as ruinous as a war, blockades. So a lot of the sanctions idea comes from colonial conflict, from gunboat diplomacy and blockades. And it allows countries that are richer in resources or have important navies to blockade and prevent countries which are less powerful from gaining foodstuff, weapons, industrial necessities for their trade and commerce. Now, of course, these sanctions inevitably affect civilians because they are passed down to civilians immediately, even if they are meant to be targeted at political leaders and military leaders and all the rest. So not only do they refuse to differentiate between war and peace, they actually deliberately target civilians, but they seem to be somehow less violent because guns and swords and things aren't used. Now, with a sanctions regime, which only gets ramped up as time goes on, what you have, therefore, is the erosion of neutrality. And once the United Nations is created with the United States, especially after the Cold War, as the chief global hegemon, then you have third-party sanctions where not only do you prevent trade, etc., yourself, but you force other people to do so as well. So really you have an expansion of total war and the kind of complete disintegration of any idea of neutrality. And with that, I would argue, any idea of the international order itself. But things are obviously changing, because with the Ukraine war, for the first time, you have a great refusal. Many countries are refusing to be part of sanctions. And notice that this happens after the last great global conflict, which was the global war on terror, where everyone in the whole world signed up. Right? There was no one who did not sign up to that war, but it was nevertheless a massive disaster. So I think the refusal in the Ukraine war has very little, if anything, to do with people being pro-Russia or anti-Russia or pro-Ukraine or anti-Ukraine. What in fact you have happening is a kind of disavowed or default re-emergence of neutrality. So countries like Turkey are happy to sell drones to Ukraine while also trading with Russia. They're even-handed. Countries like Pakistan, have returned to the American security umbrella and are selling weapons to Ukraine, but also enjoy good relations with Russia. Now, this is not just a return to the old politics of non-alignment, because non-alignment depended on the idea of a bipolar world, a bipolar global order, the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies. There is no bipolar global order, and there is no non-aligned order, therefore. What, in fact, I think you have happening is the kind of uneasy and undesigned, perhaps, feeling out of a new politics of neutrality without anyone really using that word. The genealogy for this goes back a bit further, though. So I'm thinking here of the kind of suicidal and sacrificial acts of the previous targets of sanctions followed by war. So starting with Manuel Noriega in Panama, moving on to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and then Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, what you have happening is really extraordinary. You have politicians who were for decades known as the consummate survivors of the global order. They didn't have any ideological principles to speak of. They were there to survive and to amass power. None of them were nice guys, but they knew how to survive, and they were willing to do business with anyone, including the United States. So for various reasons, including the fact that a sanctions regime and its context in total war no longer allowed for exits. So it used to be the case, even after the First World War, where the Kaiser was allowed to go into exile. You didn't have to kill him. You didn't have to put him on trial. That was what diplomacy meant. You allowed him to exit so you could make a transformation possible. Now no exit is possible, so people have their backs against the wall and they have to go down with the countries. Even so, one might ask, why did they do it? I just wonder whether these acts of refusal, suicidal refusal, were the, as it were, opening salvos in what I'm calling a great refusal. The refusal to be part of this kind of international order, which is actually a dereliction of international order, because it discounts diplomacy, it relies on total war, and it attacks civilians, in fact. Today, the successors of these bad guys who went down in flames are not likely to go down in flames, but they are the successors of the bad guys anyway. We can, I think, make a genealogy of this sort. And what they're doing is refusing to be part of a bloc mentality. So they can deal with all sides. This is not the Cold War making of blocs, in other words. It is the remaking of neutrality, and in doing so, the remaking through neutrality of an international order in which conflict is restricted and in which total war is forbidden and war against civilians is forbidden. Different actors are doing things differently. Russia and China are very keen on re-establishing a kind of throwback version of the United Nations order of the Cold War. So they want to go back to the old UN where, the chief prerequisite is the defense of the sovereignty of each of its members. So they don't want preemptive wars, interventions, and all the rest. Now that's a kind of curiously nostalgic vision of the international order. But what's ironic about it is that they're the only ones who want to, at least ostentatiously, defend the UN system. Everyone else in the West doesn't talk about the UN at all. They just talk about something called the rules-based international order, which, as no less a person than Putin commented upon, is not the same thing as international law. These are all, actions done outside international law and outside the UN system. So it's no international order at all. Or rather, you have two versions of an international order. Both of them are outside the UN system and international law. One is the Western American-led one, which is we are going to have a sanctions regime in which the UN can play a role or it needn't. We're just going to bypass it altogether, even though we are the ones who founded the UN in the first place. So this is an act of extraordinary treachery by the very founders of the international order after the Second World War. The second version of creating a new international order is by these countries, mostly in the global south, that have said, sorry, we are not going to be part of this politics. We'll deal with everyone. And we also won't necessarily go through the UN. So you have Russia and China that are dedicated to the UN. The other two don't seem to really care one way or the other. Now, in all these cases, what I think we're looking at is the emergence of a multipolar world, but not necessarily one that's defined in terms of blocks. And what could a multipolar world look like? Well, I think the only way you can have one is by going back to the Cold War vocabulary, is relations of détente between the great powers. So Russia, China, the United States, perhaps India, if it should become a great power, would have to be in a position of détente with one another. And that would mean that the truly active countries, politically and diplomatically, would be the middle-ranking powers. And indeed, they already are active. They're already far more active than anyone else. Turkey is one, Pakistan could be another, Iran is already a third in many ways. And there will be others around the globe. Brazil, perhaps, South Africa trying. You already have the lineaments of a new order which is not yet formalized coming into being. And that, I think, will be a very, very interesting thing if and when it should appear. But the important thing, I think, is to note that it is through the return of neutrality that something new is coming into the world and redefining the global order as we know it.